Russia's war on Ukraine has raged on now for over 2 years, and the cost to both sides have been immense. One of the possible spoils, however, of victory could also be what is in the ground. Ukraine has huge deposits of lithium. That's an important metal for batteries that power electric cars or smartphones.
Fighting near the Ukrainian village of Korohovo earlier this year. Above the ground, towns that have seen dozens of tank battles since the war began. What you don't see is the hundreds of millions of dollars of lithium that geologists say is likely underground. Ukraine has significant deposits of natural resources that could make Russia's war financially pay off. In addition to lithium, there are significant oil, gas, metal ores, rare earth, and precious metals buried beneath the soil, potentially worth more than $20 trillion. Lithium is a key material for the future of electric cars and many smart technologies. Ukraine's deposits are located in the Kirovohrad and Donetsk regions. Kirovohrad is still under Ukrainian control, while much of Donetsk is occupied by Russia. Before the war, the European Union had its eye on Ukraine's deposits, especially of lithium. It currently imports almost all of the mineral from China. In 2021, the EU and Ukraine agreed to a strategic partnership for raw materials.
There is enormous potential because critical raw material essential for decarbonizing of our economies can be found in abundance in Ukraine.
According to the U.S., the war in Ukraine has cost Russia well over $1 trillion in economic losses, as well as hundreds of billions in expenses on the war itself. But the trillions hiding under Ukraine's fields and factories would far outweigh that in a war that's had such a massive human cost.
Well, joining me now from Washington is Gracelin Baskaran. She's the director of the Project on Critical Mineral Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Baskaran, it's good to have you with us tonight. Let's just look at the last few years. In 2020, the European Union approved the Green Deal, which meant demand for electric cars would soon surge, demand for lithium batteries as well. 6 months later, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. Is that a coincidence?
Resources have sometimes been an incentive, but I don't think there's any case for causation here. When we actually go back and look at how much lithium does Ukraine have, Ukrainian researchers have estimated that the eastern region has about 500,000 tons of lithium, which is significant, given that particularly, as we said earlier, we need it for decarbonization goals. However, that still amounts to about 2% of global reserves. But now if you think about it in the big picture of what the invasion has actually cost Russia in terms of sanctions, in terms of trade, some of these other dimensions, it's pretty significant. So it's a bit of a stretch, I would argue, to say that he went for those resources.
How big of a deal is it if this ends up in Vladimir Putin's hands? I mean, is it enough to delay or to even possibly sink Europe's transition to clean energy?
So in terms of lithium, when we look at countries that have significantly larger reserves of lithium than what we think we have in Ukraine, we're looking at Chile, Argentina, the US, Canada, China, of course. And so what it could look like is the Ukraine would be a closer source of lithium. But a lot of this, again, is undeveloped resources. Bringing natural resource like, mines online can take 10, 15, 20 years at times. So this would be a very long-term undertaking in Ukraine to start with. In the near term, I don't think we're going to see that impact as strongly. However, what we do know is that we have this from global experience for centuries now, is that resources can prolong conflict. So if Putin chooses to build those mines out, take those resources, he can use it to fund future conflict.
Do you see, considering there is this deposit there, that part of it is in the Donbass where you have these Russian-controlled forces now, is that a disincentive, do you think, for Vladimir Putin if he does sit down at the negotiating table to agree to return territory to Ukraine, considering what's underneath the soil?
Yeah, so there's two things to unpack there. One is that, of course, resources could be a disincentive, right? There's very monetizable resources under your feet. So there does carry that power. But the second thing we have to remember that I think isn't being talked about as much is that mining is incredibly energy intensive. In some countries, it can use a third to half of the country's grid power. Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been wiped out pretty severely. I think over half of its power generating capacity is gone now. We're on rolling blackout. So the fact is that they're so far of rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure to even get to a point that you can mine, is that of course it could be a bargaining chip because there's money underground, but it could also turn around to be an incentive to rebuild the infrastructure if you are to ever want to mine.
What would it mean for Ukraine if it loses control of these lithium deposits that are at present, underneath Ukrainian territory?
Well, those resources wouldn't be theirs to be able to benefit from. So essentially what that means is the permitting would be done by Russia. They would get to decide who mines it. Therefore, whoever mines it pays taxes to Russia. So what ends up happening is the country socioeconomically does not actually benefit from the resources under their feet if they're not the ones who own, if Ukraine as a government does not own those resources.
And, if you look into the future, and I'm talking near future here, what type of role do you see valuable minerals playing in the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I mean, are we talking about a role that is getting bigger by the day?
I think as we start to look at what the next phase is, we're talking about reconstruction. We're talking a lot about private sector investment. How do we get Ukraine back on its feet? What does that look like? Natural resources are going to be a part of that. And we've seen this kind of across major emerging economies that as we look at economic recovery, mineral resources are a core part of that because it is something that can build get the investment, get the infrastructure, get the jobs going. However, right now, I'm going to just pull back and look quickly at Russia next door. The other day, we were looking at the data in terms of nickel, palladium, uranium. Russia is still producing the same amount of resources as they were in 2021 by and large, but the exploration has dropped off by over 60, 70%. So the biggest risk we face going forward is because when you combine political and economic risk, lack of infrastructure, companies are going to be less likely to explore the region. Right now, a lot of the deposits are at speculatory phase. They're not at a point where we can be like, I'm going to drill a mine tomorrow. So we need that bridge now is growing to be able to go from speculation to production.
Gracelin, Baskaran, we appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to welcome Olivia Lazard, a fellow at Carnegie Europe, an expert on geopolitics, for more on this issue. So conventional wisdom in the West is that the driving force behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine was Putin's vision of establishing a new Russian empire. But you've also argued that this is about access to critical raw materials. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for having me. Russia has essentially a bunch of different aims. One of them is obviously to recover control over Ukraine. Parts of the Ukraine attraction lies in the strategic materials that the world is now fully interested in for green transitions, but also for digital and defense transitions. Russia is looking to have access to a number of critical raw materials for its own needs regarding defense, but also in terms of sustaining its partnership with China. It's also vastly interested in making sure that the European Union essentially fails in the promise of its Green Deal, and particularly in its climate law, which requires the European Union to decarbonize by at least 55% by 2030 and to be fully carbon neutral by 2050. If it fails to do so, it has democratic consequences that will have reverberations in terms of democratic fabrics coming undone within the European Union.
So you're saying that part of Russia's calculation is the EU's goals. We've heard the EU's long hoped that Ukrainian resources would help them become less dependent on countries like China. Is that what you think Russia's calculation is? And is that then also part of the incentive for the EU backing Ukraine?
The EU has, as you mentioned in your sort of capsule before, it had struck a strategic partnership based on raw materials with Ukraine in July 2021, just short of 6 months before the war of invasion. the relationship between the EU and Ukraine regarding the future pipeline for raw materials predates the war. So there is no question, essentially, that it is part of the reasons that the EU wants to sustain and support Ukraine, but it goes much further than this. The EU has understood, essentially, that there is something at stake regarding the rule of law, regarding democratic fabrics, regarding, essentially, the future security of Europe as a whole, not just Ukraine. But if we look at the larger picture, the reason why I argued that Russia is particularly interested in Ukrainian resources regarding critical raw materials is that Russia is actually active not just in Ukraine, but in a number of different theaters via other means, via disinformation, via political influencing, by industrial influencing as well, to try and make sure that it essentially becomes a geo-economic power broker for all energy and industrial and critical supply chains, including food for that matter, and potentially water in the future, which will define essentially the future of security, not just from an industrial and economic perspective, but security in an age where there is essentially a number of climate disruptions coming our way. So Russia has a very strong purview regarding a long-term game, and that's why we need to understand Ukraine as part of a larger chess game and part of a larger sort of arsenal of war that Russia is waging against Europe, against Ukraine, and for its own supremacy in the future.
And joining us now from Bucharest is Andrei Covatariu. He's an international energy expert and co-founder of ECERA. That's a forum for sharing sustainability knowledge. Now, what role did Ukraine's natural resources play in Putin's plans to invade, you think?
Thank you for having me. So, of course, critical raw materials in general in Ukraine are not the main reason why Russia is taking this unjustified war in Ukraine, but it could be, as you mentioned, a significant benefit in a positive military scenario for Kremlin. So a potential scenario in which Russia would control some of these regions that are rich in critical raw materials would basically reinforce Russia's role in the global energy commodities markets. So apart from being still relevant on the fossil fuel resources side, it would also increase its critical minerals portfolio, which is critical, as you mentioned, to the energy transition process globally.
Now, but what would it mean if Russia was successful for, let's say, the worldwide transition to green technology, if large parts of the lithium market are in Russia's hands?
So it's important to understand from the beginning that Russia has also its own resources when it comes to critical raw materials, when it comes to lithium, but Russia was never able to scale up the mining, the refining processes, as well as the manufacturing that is based on these resources. But its partnership with China would basically mean that together the two countries would reinforce the energy security dominance through Russia's fossil fuel reserves, and now through some additional critical raw materials, and also through Chinese mining, refining, and manufacturing experience, because China controls these markets significantly. But I think it's also important to understand that in the scenario that we are talking about, that would also affect the Western world's capacity and the pace of the energy transition process. It would limit basically access to supply of these critical raw materials, which may lead to higher prices. And equally, I think it's important to understand that it would also affect Ukraine's potential for reconstruction, because after the war would end, Ukraine will aim to build back its economy, and critical raw materials may play a significant role in that, provided that Kiev can actually benefit from that.
Now, many Western countries were betting that Ukrainian resources would help the West become less dependent on Russia and China. You mentioned that. Now, could Putin use these resources as a bargaining chip, maybe, if Kiev is pressured to accept an end to the war on Russia's terms?
Just to put a perspective and some numbers, so the International Energy Agency forecasts that the demand for lithium alone will triple by the end of this decade, will increase tenfold by 2050. So just to come back to your point, any player that controls a significant portion of the market for these critical raw materials, today mostly in Chinese hands, but that could change in this duo that I'm talking about, can have a higher geopolitical leverage, of course. And the energy geopolitics of tomorrow will be based on the control, the mining, the refining of these critical raw materials. So, of course, that can be one of the tools of Kremlin's toolbox in the future, provided that they will be able to control that, and they will be able to design a framework where they can use that either through, as you said, through using them in the energy transition process, or basically limiting supply for Western world that needs that intensively in the next few decades.
The energy expert Andrei Covatariu there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, for more now, I'm joined by Ulrich Blum. He's a professor emeritus of economics and founder and CEO of the German Lithium Institute. He's also considered to be an expert on economic warfare. Professor Blum, it's good to have you with us. Do you think Ukraine's mineral riches, especially its lithium deposits, do you think they were Vladimir Putin's main reason for invading Ukraine?
What do they mean? They mean that his model of financing his state will collapse with the climate transition. And if it collapses with climate transition, what does the result be? It is that he is financially down. And so I think getting the lithium and other mineral resources where Ukraine is number 2, 3, 4, sometimes only one step behind Russia in exploration is this very, very rational way of trying to stabilize his rule and his system, his autocratic system.
Do we know, has Russia already been able to access the lithium that is in the deposits there in the Donbass region?
We don't know of any refinement and for especially enrichment, because the lithium you have in the Donbass area is a lithium which is by average below 1%. And you have to enrich it. It's in these petalites, in these minerals, you have to enrich it to 5.5 to 5.8% to sell it on the world market in order to process it in refineries and converters to lithium hydroxide monohydrate. And that's the battery grade stuff. Mm-hmm. And this would take machinery, that would take converters, and we don't know of any of these things being deployed in Russia.
So what would Russian control of the Donbass lithium, what would it mean for the world's energy transition away from fossil fuels, or would it have any impact?
Well, if Russia gets the Donbass, especially, and controls even more, because in the center of Ukraine there is the Dobra block lithium deposit, which is much richer and much better and much more exploitable. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the situation for Europe gets worse, because Europe could get most of the minerals necessary for energy transition from Ukraine. And Ukraine, by that, could finance the reconstruction of its country, which will cost much, much more than the World Bank estimates. So if we can drive Putin out of all these areas, it's a big, big benefit, not only for energy transition in Europe, but also the reconstruction of Ukraine. And that is, of course, what Putin doesn't want. Yeah. And let me add one word. Even if he only controls Donbass, all the rest of the region is at risk. And do you want to invest if the region is at risk? No.
Well, all of this makes Ukraine seem even that much more important to Europe, right? When you consider that it has this lithium, even in the central part of the country, which is still in Ukrainian hands. If the EU wants to build a batteries industry, it needs to have a free, democratic Ukraine that's part of the EU, right?
Right, exactly. That's what I always say. And that's what was our memorandum that we sent out last year. And that's why we think we have to support them. Because if we don't support them, it will cost much, much more than anything else. And you see the intent of Putin because he wants the land, not the people. And his strategy in his warfare is just emptying the country, just getting the area.
Yeah, just emptying the country and then taking a bulldozer to see what's beneath the ground. Obviously, he knows what he will find.
Yeah, he knows. These things have all been explored under Soviet times.
Yeah.
So the deposits that we know are all the cartography is all from Soviet times, so they know well.
Okay, Mr. Blum, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we certainly appreciate your time and your valuable analysis tonight. Thank you. Come back again.
Yeah, bye-bye.